Chapter 1. A Bell That Wouldn't Ring. The morning was bright, touched softly by golden sunlight filtering through the tall arched windows of St. Mary Mead's quaint stone church. Villagers murmured quietly, gathering hymn books and exchanging warm nods before service began. Miss Jane Marple sat discreetly near the back, her sharp eyes gently scanning familiar faces, noting slight changes with quiet curiosity. Exactly at 10 o'clock, Reverend Leonard Cartwright, dignified but visibly distracted, rose to start the service. His clear voice wavered slightly, echoing through the peaceful stillness as he began his greeting. The congregation stood, ready for the resonant tolling of the old church bell to mark the official commencement of worship. Yet silence persisted. Missy Marple tilted her head slightly, listening intently. The expected rich, comforting toll did not arrive. Instead, an uneasy quiet seeped through the rows of pews, pressing heavily upon the expectant villagers. Faint whispers arose, cautious glances exchanged. Reverend Cartwright cleared his throat, his voice betraying mild embarrassment. "Forgive me," he said gently. "Perhaps something has jammed. We shall begin nonetheless." But before he could continue, hurried footsteps echoed sharply against the stone flooring. A young verger, face pale and stricken, burst from a side door, his voice trembling. "Reverend Cartwright! Quickly, sir, it's Mr. Eldridge in the tower. He's—" The boy's voice cracked, unable to continue. A sudden chill passed through Miss Marple's chest as she watched Reverend Cartwright hurry away with an expression of stunned dread. Several villagers rose from their seats, confusion and anxiety rippling through the congregation. Miss Marple quietly observed the panic, already feeling the quiet, persistent whisper of suspicion. Moments later, solemn-faced Reverend Cartwright returned. He raised a trembling hand to silence the gathering whispers. "I fear there will be no service this morning," he said softly, eyes glistening. "The bell did not ring, because Mr. Eldridge, our beloved bell-ringer, has been found dead." Gasps filled the church, voices rising in shocked murmurs. Miss Marple sat quietly, her fingers lightly clasped, eyes sharp yet thoughtful. Her gaze wandered slowly upward, toward the shadowy recesses of the silent bell tower, a place now touched irrevocably by tragedy, and, she suspected, quiet malice. As villagers spilled out into the bright sunlight, Miss Marple lingered. She adjusted her shawl thoughtfully, quietly turning toward Reverend Cartwright, her gentle voice barely above a whisper. "May I perhaps have a look, Reverend? I find that sometimes what the bell does not say can tell us far more." The vicar, pale and unsettled, nodded mutely, stepping aside. With careful steps, Miss Marple ascended toward the quiet, shadowy heart of the tower, each echoing footstep bringing her closer to a mystery waiting silently in the gloom. Chapter 2. Whisperings After Service. The bell tower was dim, lit only by thin streaks of sunlight filtering through narrow slits in ancient stone walls. Miss Marple climbed the worn steps carefully, sensing the weight of generations in the polished edges beneath her fingertips. The stillness up here felt unnatural, marred by tragedy, tension lingering in the silence. At the landing, Miss Marple paused, The body of old Albert Eldridge had already been respectfully removed, but faint evidence of chaos remained. A toppled stool, a coiled rope hanging loosely, and faint scuff marks across the dusty floorboards. Constable Wiggins, earnest but uncertain, stood awkwardly beside Reverend Cartwright, whose gaze was clouded with grief. The vicar gestured weakly at the scene. "We found him right there," he murmured. "Poor Albert must have fallen, or—" Miss Marple nodded slowly, gaze fixed thoughtfully upon the rope. "Or he was helped along, perhaps." Constable Wiggins shifted, uncomfortably, eyes widening. "Now, Miss Marple, surely you don't think—" "I think," she gently interrupted, voice soft yet firm, "that it's best we remain open to every possibility." Her gaze swept the room again, noting the faint trail of footprints that led toward a shadowed corner, then disappeared. Quietly, she stepped forward, bending slowly to examine a tiny fragment of cloth snagged on a splintered beam. Miss Marple's fingers brushed against it lightly, a delicate piece of lace, frayed and oddly out of place in this stark, dusty room. "Interesting," she murmured, barely audible. Reverend Cartwright watched her anxiously. "Have you found something, Miss Marple?" "Oh, perhaps," she said lightly, tucking the lace discreetly into her pocket. "But I mustn't jump to conclusions just yet." Returning to the warmth of daylight outside the church, Miss Marple lingered near the gathering villagers, carefully observing the murmured conversations. Fear and speculation passed quietly between them, each face offering subtle revelations. She noticed Eleanor Davenport, elegantly dressed yet oddly distracted, twisting the handle of her parasol anxiously. Beside her stood Richard Havisham, whose stiff posture and tightened jaw suggested discomfort deeper than mere grief. Miss Marple approached with quiet grace, offering an empathetic nod. "Such dreadful news," she remarked softly. Eleanor's eyes darted nervously. "Dreadful indeed, Miss Marple. Albert was so dependable. Such an odd accident." "An accident?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, voice gently curious. "Do you believe it was?" Richard cleared his throat sharply. What else could it be? Albert was elderly. The tower stairs are hazardous. Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly on Richard's, polished shoes dusty from a recent climb, before lifting to meet his uneasy eyes. "Hazardous indeed," she echoed gently. "One must always step carefully." Richard's cheeks flushed faintly, and he abruptly excused himself, leaving Eleanor to exchange an awkward glance with Miss Marple. "I suppose we're all a bit shaken," Eleanor murmured hurriedly. "Please excuse me." Miss Marple watched them, part ways, thoughtfully considering their quiet evasions. Nearby, Mrs. Agatha Price leaned forward eagerly, whispering conspiratorially to a circle of attentive listeners, her voice carrying just enough. "Albert was seen arguing last evening, you know, with Reverend Cartwright himself." Gasps followed, voices rising. Miss Marple merely raised an eyebrow thoughtfully, absorbing the quiet undercurrents of suspicion swirling gently beneath the village's carefully kept surface. As whispers thickened into rumours, Miss Marple withdrew, quietly, her mind turning to the fragment of lace safely tucked away. She felt certain the truth was hidden, not only within the tower's shadows, but woven carefully into the village's own silent secrets. Chapter 3. Hidden in the Belfry. The following afternoon, Miss Marple returned quietly to the church grounds, stepping through dappled shadows cast by ancient oaks lining the path. Villagers passed by, casting uneasy glances toward the silent bell tower, quickly averting their eyes. She smiled politely, noting how the church, once comforting, had swiftly become a place of whispered fears. She carefully ascended the worn stairs again, this time alone, listening attentively to the creaks beneath her feet. Reaching the belfry, Miss Marple paused. Sunlight barely pierced the gloom, but it was enough to reveal a pattern she'd missed before. The scuff marks were not random. They traced deliberate movements toward the darkest corner. Miss Marple moved closer, carefully studying the floorboards. Her fingers gently pressed against the rough wood, and slowly she knelt, eyes sharp and attentive. She detected a slight gap between two boards, subtle but unmistakably intentional. Using her knitting needle, she gently pried up the loose plank, heart quickening slightly at what lay hidden beneath. A small leather-bound journal lay neatly concealed within the recess. She lifted it delicately, brushing away a thin film of dust. Flipping carefully through the pages, Miss Marple realized she held Albert Eldridge's private notes. The entries were brief, cryptic, hinting at an ongoing dispute, something involving Reverend Cartwright and an unknown figure Albert, referred to simply as R. She paused at the final entry, written hurriedly, "Must confront R tonight. Secrets can't stay buried. Bell will ring truth." Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward to the bell itself, looming silently above her. Its stillness now felt ominous, guarding truths unspoken. She gently replaced the journal in its hiding place, carefully restoring the plank. Rising quietly, she became aware of another presence, a shadow silently waiting in the stairwell. Miss Marple straightened, voice calm and unruffled. "You may as well come out, dear. I find conversations easier when I can see whom I'm speaking with." After a hesitant pause, Eleanor Davenport stepped forward, nervously clutching a silk handkerchief. "I didn't mean to intrude," Eleanor began haltingly. "I only came to see if Albert had left anything behind." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. "And did you find what you sought?" Eleanor's gaze darted downward. "No, but he knew things that would hurt so many if they came out." Miss Marple studied Eleanor quietly. "Things involving Reverend Cartwright?" Eleanor stiffened. Reverend Cartwright was helping Albert to protect the village. Albert had become obsessed. He believed someone had committed a terrible wrong many years ago. Miss Marple considered this carefully. "And you know who that someone is?" Eleanor hesitated, her voice barely audible. "No, but Albert said the bell would reveal everything." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said gently, "we should listen more closely to its silence." Eleanor glanced nervously toward the bell before retreating swiftly down the stairs, leaving Miss Marple standing thoughtfully in the shadows. Descending shortly afterward, Miss Marple stepped out into the churchyard, thoughts carefully turning over the puzzle pieces. Before she could proceed further, Reverend Cartwright approached, clearly agitated, hands twisting anxiously. "Miss Marple," he began uncertainly, "I fear I'm being accused by whispers, suspected of Albert's death." She met his troubled gaze calmly. "Then tell me, Reverend, what secrets does this bell guard so fiercely that a man had to die to silence it?" Reverend Cartwright sighed deeply, his voice heavy with regret. Old sins, Miss Marple. Sins from a past everyone hoped forgotten." Miss Marple nodded gently, eyes focused keenly on the tower looming above. But secrets never remain truly silent, do they? And with that quiet certainty, she stepped away, aware that the bell tower had only begun to yield its carefully kept secrets. Chapter 4. A Tea-Stained Confession. That afternoon, the village buzzed quietly with anticipation, gathering at the vicarage for tea, a tradition meant to comfort, but today clouded by unease. Miss Marple arrived punctually, pausing briefly at the doorway to note the murmured exchanges and nervous glances. Quietly observing from her favourite corner, she settled comfortably, knitting needles clicking softly, eyes gently attentive. Across the room, Reverend Cartwright tried to maintain an appearance of calm hospitality, but worry etched deeply into his features. He poured tea with slightly trembling hands, barely noticing as the liquid splashed onto the pristine white tablecloth, staining it faintly. "Forgive me," he murmured, distractedly blotting at the stain. "I seem quite clumsy today." Miss Marple raised her teacup gently, gaze subtly tracing the stain. "Small mistakes often reveal much, Reverend." He glanced up sharply, startled, then slowly relaxed. "Perhaps you're right, Miss Marple." From the doorway, Richard Havisham watched carefully, his posture stiff and uncomfortable. He approached, hesitantly joining their conversation. I believe people are exaggerating this tragedy," he said brusquely, avoiding direct eye contact. "Surely it was simply an accident." Miss Marple considered him quietly, noting the slight flush of his cheeks and the nervous adjustment of his tie. "Is that what you believe, Mr. Havisham? Or is it merely what you hope?" Richard flinched, voice tight with agitation. Albert Eldridge was known to meddle, digging into private matters that should have stayed buried. "Private matters?" Miss Marple echoed gently, knitting needles, briefly pausing. Richard hesitated, glancing quickly around the room, his voice lowered to a tense whisper. Albert had become convinced there'd been foul play decades ago. A death everyone agreed was an accident, but he wouldn't leave it alone. "Whose death?" she asked calmly. Richard shifted uncomfortably. "His niece, Louisa Eldridge. She drowned 20 years ago, but Albert recently claimed he'd discovered proof that it was murder." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythmic clicking, her voice soothingly gentle. "Then Albert Eldridge's death seems most conveniently timed, doesn't it?" Richard looked away abruptly, mumbling apologies and excusing himself hurriedly. As he departed, Eleanor Davenport approached carefully, eyes darting nervously. She held her teacup delicately, hands trembling slightly, glancing over her shoulder before whispering urgently, "Miss Marple, you must know something. Albert was threatening to expose someone prominent in the village. I fear that's why he's dead." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, her eyes gentle yet sharp. "And whom did Albert suspect?" Eleanor leaned closer, voice barely audible, breath unsteady. "He mentioned someone's initials. H.H." Miss Marple's gaze flicked subtly toward Richard Havisham, retreating hurriedly through the doorway. "Indeed," she murmured quietly. "Dredge." Suddenly aware of Mrs. Price lingering nearby, Miss Marple lifted her voice pleasantly. "More tea, Mrs. Price?" Startled, Mrs. Price nodded, eagerly leaning forward. "It's dreadful, Miss Marple. People say Albert kept a journal. Something terribly damaging." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow delicately. "Oh? Perhaps someone feared Albert would ring the bell and expose long-hidden sins." Mrs. Price blinked rapidly, intrigued but uncertain. "Precisely, Miss Marple, precisely." Miss Marple's knitting needles moved gently, thoughtfully, her voice a quiet reflection. "Secrets, Mrs. Price, are like tea stains, easy to spill, but much harder to erase. Around them, villagers murmured anxiously, conversations heavy with suspicion and unease." Miss Marple quietly observed, her mind piecing together hidden threads of guilt, fear, and whispered regrets. She knew that beneath the quiet civility of tea and sympathy, darker truths simmered dangerously, waiting for the right moment to spill forth. Chapter 5. The Vicar's Secret. Early the following morning, Miss Marple walked quietly through the dew-dampened churchyard, her footsteps muted by soft grass. She paused briefly, studying the church's tranquil facade, now marred by suspicion. Near the rectory gate stood Reverend Cartwright, pacing anxiously, visibly shaken. "Reverend," she greeted softly, "you seem distressed." He glanced up sharply, visibly startled, then offered a weary smile. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you. Perhaps you're right. My mind's been quite unsettled." She regarded him gently. "Albert Eldridge troubled you deeply, did he not?" Cartwright sighed heavily, eyes filled with regret. "He uncovered painful secrets. Not mine, precisely, but I promised to guard them." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, patiently awaiting further revelation. After a moment's hesitation, the Reverend motioned her quietly inside the rectory. Once alone in the hushed parlour, he spoke softly, his voice strained with anxiety. Albert believed Louisa Eldridge's drowning years ago was no accident. He'd found proof, letters hidden in the church. He insisted we reveal the truth, but I feared such revelations would harm innocent people in the village. "Whose letters, Reverend?" Miss Marple gently probed. Cartwright hesitated. "Richard Haversham's father, Reginald Haversham. He and Louisa were secretly engaged, but she broke off their relationship shortly before she died. Albert believed Reginald killed her, then staged the drowning." Miss Marple watched him carefully. "And you feared Richard would suffer from the truth of his father's past?" The Reverend nodded, eyes shadowed with guilt. "Richard has always been fragile. Albert demanded I confront Richard. He was certain Richard already knew. But I hesitated, and now Albert is dead. I fear Richard might have done something drastic." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Secrets like these seldom remain buried quietly, Reverend. Do you have the letters?" "Albert took them, Miss Marple," Cartwright admitted quietly. "But I fear they've vanished since his death." She smiled faintly, her expression enigmatic. Perhaps not entirely. Before the Reverend could respond, a hesitant knock echoed faintly. Eleanor Davenport entered slowly, her expression drawn and tense. "Forgive the intrusion," she whispered nervously. "Miss Marple, Reverend, I have something I must confess." Miss Marple regarded her gently. "Please, my dear, sit down." Eleanor sank into a chair, voice trembling. "Albert confided in me about those letters. He entrusted them briefly to me, but I was frightened. I handed them over to Richard. Reverend Cartwright's face paled visibly. "Then Richard knows the truth." "He does," Eleanor murmured miserably, "and he burned the letters immediately. He said the past should remain silent. Albert confronted him about it the night before he died. They argued bitterly." Miss Marple nodded quietly. "An argument severe. Enough for violence, Eleanor?" Eleanor hesitated. "Perhaps. Richard was desperate, but he swears he didn't kill Albert." Miss Marple rose slowly, calmly adjusting her shawl. Then we must look closely at who else had reason to ensure the bell never told the truth. She quietly stepped to the window, watching the church tower thoughtfully. "It seems," she murmured softly, "the silent bell guards many secrets, and perhaps more than one killer." Behind her, Reverend Cartwright and Eleanor Davenport exchanged anxious glances, each silently wondering whose secrets were yet to be revealed, and at what cost. Chapter 6. The photograph in the vestry. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple quietly entered the small church vestry, its cool silence heavy with secrets. Sunlight filtered softly through stained-glass windows, scattering muted colours across the floor. Her fingers lightly traced the polished oak table, noting scattered hymnals and neatly stacked sheets of sermon notes. She paused, gaze catching on a small drawer partially open. With quiet precision, Miss Marple gently slid it open fully, revealing scattered papers, and a photograph lying face down beneath them. Carefully, she lifted it, turning it over slowly. The image was faded but recognizable. A young Louisa Eldridge stood smiling beside Reginald Havisham, their youthful faces filled with innocent joy. Yet behind them, nearly obscured in shadow, stood a third figure, watching intently, eyes fixed upon Louisa with unmistakable intensity. Miss Marple studied it closely, her gaze sharp, mind turning quickly. The figure was young but unmistakably familiar. Reverend Cartwright, barely older than a boy himself. "Ah," she murmured softly, thoughtfully, "secrets indeed." Quiet footsteps echoed lightly behind her. She turned calmly as Reverend Cartwright appeared in the doorway, hesitating when he saw the photograph in her hand. "I see you found it," he said quietly, shoulders sagging. "Yes," she replied gently. "You cared deeply for Louisa yourself, didn't you?" He nodded slowly, sadness lingering in his gaze. "I loved her, but she never knew. She chose Reginald, though he didn't deserve her. When Louisa drowned, my grief made me suspect him, but I had no proof." Miss Marple regarded him sympathetically, voice gentle yet firm. "Albert believed otherwise. He was certain the letters were proof enough." Cartwright lowered his gaze guiltily. "Albert didn't understand. The letters revealed anger and jealousy, but no clear guilt. I hid them originally to prevent scandal, but Albert became obsessed. He accused me of protecting a murderer." "Is that why you argued?" she quietly asked. He nodded heavily. "I begged him to leave the past buried, but Albert insisted on ringing the bell to summon the village, to reveal everything. I was terrified of the consequences." Miss Marple studied him closely. "Terrified enough to silence him permanently?" The Reverend shook his head vehemently. "No, I swear, Miss Marple, I didn't harm Albert. I couldn't." Her eyes held his, calm yet penetrating. Then perhaps the killer knew you'd be easily blamed. Before Cartwright could answer, the vestry door creaked open again, revealing Richard, Havisham, pale and visibly shaken. I must speak," Richard stammered anxiously. "Miss Marple, you must understand. I never intended harm. Albert threatened me, yes, but he was alive when I left him." Miss Marple's voice remained soothing. "Yet you burned the letters, Richard. Why?" Richard hesitated, guilt etched into his face. "My father was no murderer. Those letters proved nothing but youthful bitterness. Albert wanted vengeance for a crime that never happened." Miss Marple held his gaze gently. "Yet Albert is now dead. Convenient, isn't it?" Richard swallowed heavily. "I swear I left him alive, but I saw someone else approaching the tower as I left. A woman." Miss Marple's expression sharpened subtly. "Did you recognize her?" Richard shook his head slowly. It was too dark. But she wore a scarf, something delicate, laced. Miss Marple's fingers brushed lightly against the fragment of lace, tucked safely in her pocket, voice barely audible. "Indeed." Turning quietly to Reverend Cartwright, she placed the photograph gently back into his trembling hand. "Perhaps the past has finally come for its reckoning. Now, Reverend, I believe I must speak to Eleanor Davenport." As she stepped outside into the soft afternoon light, Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty that the photograph had revealed more than nostalgia. It had unveiled motive, jealousy, and hidden grief. Now she needed only one quiet confession to bring clarity to the silent bell's guarded secret. Chapter 7. Midnight Footsteps. Nightfall cast St. Mary Mead into quiet shadows, only faintly pierced by the glow of street lamps lining the village lanes. From her cottage window, Miss Marple observed the silent village thoughtfully, knitting needles clicking softly in rhythm with her calm reflections. She felt certain the answers lay hidden beneath carefully preserved lies and whispers of the past. A faint sound broke her contemplation, the creak of her garden gate opening quietly. With a gentle sigh, Miss Marple set aside her knitting, rising to answer the hesitant knock at her door. She opened it cautiously, revealing Eleanor Davenport, pale and anxious beneath the lamplight. "Forgive me for disturbing you," Eleanor whispered, urgently. "But I'm terribly frightened. I believe someone followed me here." Miss Marple ushered her gently inside, eyes briefly scanning the empty lane behind Eleanor before closing the door softly. "Tell me everything, dear." Eleanor sat uneasily, hands trembling. "Richard accused me of Albert's murder, but it wasn't me. Albert was alive when I left him." Miss Marple regarded her closely, voice gentle yet direct. "Then why hide your presence in the tower that night?" Eleanor hesitated, fingers twisting nervously. "Albert called me there. He was furious I'd given the letters to Richard. He accused me of protecting Richard out of affection. He believed I'd been in love with Richard's father, Reginald." Miss Marple's knitting needles resumed their gentle click. "And were you—" Eleanor's cheeks flushed faintly, her voice barely audible. "Yes, but Reginald loved Louisa. When she died, I blamed Reginald bitterly. I wanted him disgraced, but Albert discovered my secret letters to Reginald. He accused me of betraying Louisa." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, eyes thoughtful. "And Albert threatened to expose your betrayal." Eleanor nodded miserably. "I pleaded, but he refused to listen. I left him furious, but he was still alive. Yet, as I left, someone passed, me in the shadows." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened softly. "Could you see who it was?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded faintly. "Yes, Reverend Cartwright." Miss Marple quietly absorbed this revelation. "Indeed," she murmured thoughtfully. A sudden creaking floorboard echoed faintly from the garden path outside, drawing both women's gazes sharply toward the window. Miss Marple rose calmly, approaching cautiously. Peering through the curtains, she glimpsed a shadow retreating quickly towards the village centre, a figure limping slightly, disappearing into darkness. "Eleanor?" Miss Marple said calmly, returning to her chair. "Someone certainly fears what you might reveal." Eleanor's eyes widened fearfully. "What should I do?" Miss Marple offered a reassuring smile. "Stay quiet for now. Tomorrow, when the village gathers at the church, we'll gently unravel the truth." Eleanor nodded uneasily, rising to leave. Miss Marple watched her carefully through the window until she vanished safely into the night. Her knitting resumed, thoughtfully, mind quietly piecing together each subtle clue. She realized that beneath the tangled web of old secrets, jealousy, betrayal, and regret, a patient killer moved quietly among them. Tomorrow, she would carefully set the final trap, letting the truth ring clear where the bell had remained stubbornly silent. Chapter 8. An Unlikely Suspect. The morning dawned crisp and clear, though the chill in the air seemed to mirror the tension growing steadily in St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat in her favourite chair by the window, knitting steadily, but her mind was far from the yarn in her hands. The village was on edge, with the weight of the murder hanging over them like a cloud that refused to lift. The gathering at the church that morning was subdued. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of who could be trusted and whom they might inadvertently accuse. Reverend Cartwright, his face drawn and weary, stood at the pulpit, his voice faltering as he began the service. "Today we come, together not only to seek solace," he began, his voice unsteady, "but to find answers for the tragedy that has struck our village. We must face the truth, no matter how painful it may be." Miss Marple's eyes flicked across the room. Eleanor sat at the back, her hands tightly folded, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Richard Havisham appeared restless, glancing frequently at his watch. Mrs. Price was muttering to herself in hushed tones to anyone who would listen, her eyes darting around the room. But it was one person in particular who caught Miss Marple's attention: Mrs. Ellen Havisham, Reginald's widow and Richard's mother. She sat rigidly, her lips pressed tightly together, her eyes cold and distant, as though she were hiding something more than just grief. After the service, as the villagers gathered outside the church, Miss Marple made her way toward the Havisham family. She noted how Richard's eyes avoided his mother's, his posture tense, as if he were bracing for an explosion. Mrs. Havisham stood apart from them, staring down at her hands. Miss Marple approached them with her usual calm. "Mrs. Havisham," she began softly, "I trust you're well." Mrs. Havisham gave her a tight, controlled smile. "As well as one can be, given the circumstances, Miss Marple." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the faint tremor in her hands. "I must say, I find it curious that, despite all the speculation, the one person who seems to remain untouched by the fear that grips this village is you, Mrs. Havisham." Eleanor, standing nearby, stiffened, glancing nervously at Richard. Miss Marple caught her eye for a moment before turning back to Mrs. Havisham. "Tell me, do you not find it strange that so many are afraid, yet you seem quite serene?" Mrs. Havisham's lips tightened further. "I'm simply grieving, Miss Marple. Grieving for a son I lost long ago, and a husband whose reputation will forever be tainted." Miss Marple smiled kindly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Havisham. "Yes, indeed. It must be quite painful to lose a husband to scandal, especially one you've spent your life protecting." Richard's head snapped up at the word protecting, and Miss Marple noted the sudden discomfort in his expression. His mother's gaze softened for just a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "You think I protect my family's reputation, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Havisham asked, her voice steady but laced with something darker. "You think I would go to such lengths for their honour?" "I do," Miss Marple said gently, "because I think there's more to your story than the villagers know." Before Mrs. Havisham could reply, Richard stepped forward, his face flushed. "This is ridiculous, Miss Marple. My mother has nothing to do with this. Stop trying to drag her into this mess." Miss Marple turned to him, her expression soft but firm. "Richard, sometimes the most unlikely suspects are the ones who have the most to lose. Your mother's history with Albert, the letters, her protection of your father's legacy. All of it points to one undeniable truth. She's hiding something important." Mrs. Havisham's face remained an unreadable mask, but Miss Marple could see the faintest flicker of panic in her eyes. The woman was hiding something, and Miss Marple knew she was getting closer to the truth. The final piece was in her grasp. Richard's angry outburst only confirmed it. The killer was desperate, and now Miss Marple was determined to unmask them. All. Chapter 9. The Sound of Silence. The village of St. Mary Mead had grown eerily quiet in the days following Albert Eldridge's murder. The usual hum of gossip had all but died away, replaced by the anxious shuffling of feet and uneasy glances. Miss Marple could feel the tension thickening in the air, and it was only a matter of time before the truth, long hidden, would rise to the surface. She stood in the churchyard once again, looking up at the bell tower, which loomed silently above. The bell had not rung in days, a fitting metaphor for the silence that enveloped the village. No one spoke of the murder openly any more, though the suspicion lingered like a shadow. Miss Marple had spent hours considering the facts and weaving together the threads of the puzzle. There was one element of the mystery that nagged at her, a piece of the puzzle that hadn't yet fallen into place. The bell. It had played a central role, yet no one seemed to know why it had remained silent on the morning of Albert's death. Why, Miss Marple wondered, had the bell not tolled? She returned to the church once again, this time alone, slipping quietly into the vestry. The place was as quiet as ever, the scent of old wood and candle wax hanging in the air. Miss Marple approached the stairs to the bell tower, her footsteps muffled by the worn carpet. She knew the tower well by now, the same creaking steps, the same dust-covered beams. She had already examined the scene thoroughly, but something still felt off. At the top of the stairs, Miss Marple paused, listening carefully. The tower was as still as the rest of the church, but the silence here felt different. Tense, almost suffocating. She stepped forward, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. The bell itself hung overhead, heavy and silent, its great iron form casting long shadows on the walls. She approached it slowly, her eyes scanning every inch, but nothing seemed out of place. She reached for the rope that would normally have rung the bell, her fingers brushing the cold, dusty fibres. Then she stopped, her eyes narrowing as something caught her attention, a slight indentation in the floor, just under the bell's rope. She knelt down, tracing the mark with her fingers. It wasn't natural. Something had been dragged here, then quickly moved. Miss Marple's heart quickened as she realized that this indentation was no accident. Someone had been standing here, close to the bell, just before Albert died. Her mind raced back to the pieces of the puzzle she had already uncovered. Eleanor's confession, the letter to Reginald, Richard's strange behaviour, Mrs. Havisham's reluctance to speak. But it was the sound, or rather the lack of sound, that had always struck her as odd. The bell had been silenced deliberately at a precise moment in time. And then it clicked. The person standing here wasn't simply trying to prevent the bell from ringing. They were trying to make sure the murder would remain a secret. The murderer had known that Albert's death would create enough chaos to keep the villagers distracted. And that person, Miss Marple realized, had been someone with intimate knowledge of the bell's importance. A light tap on the door behind her interrupted her thoughts. She turned slowly, surprised to see Reverend Cartwright standing there, his face pale and weary. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. "I believe we both know the truth now." Miss Marple rose slowly, her gaze steady. "Do we, Reverend?" He stepped closer, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I never meant for any of this to happen. But Albert's obsession with the past, it pushed me to the edge. And when I saw him about to confront Richard about the letters, I panicked. I couldn't let it all come out. Not like that." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her mind was already working through the next steps. "So you did it. You killed Albert to protect your secrets." Cartwright's shoulders sagged, and he nodded grimly. "I didn't know what else to do. He was going to ruin everything. He wanted to expose what happened to Louisa, what Reginald did, and what I had done to protect him." Miss Marple studied him for a moment longer, her voice calm but firm. "But you didn't account for one thing, Reverend. You underestimated the one person who would always see through the lies. The truth would always be there, waiting, no matter how many years it was buried." She stepped back toward the bell, her hands resting lightly on the rope. "And now, the bell will ring." Chapter 10. Tea with the Murderer. The village was still in a state of quiet disarray as news of Reverend Cartwright's confession spread. The sound of the church bell, which had remained silent for so long, rang out at last, its deep chime echoing across St. Mary Mead. A murmur of relief swept through the village. But Miss Marple knew that the tolling was not just the signal of an ending. It was the ringing of truth, finally set free. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple invited Reverend Cartwright to tea. As always, her cottage was warm, the soft light of a single lamp casting shadows over the small, comfortable room. The tea was brewed perfectly, and the scones were fresh, just as she knew he would expect. It was a quiet moment, filled with the hum of the kettle and the gentle clink of china. Reverend Cartwright entered with a heaviness in his step, his usual poise shattered by the weight of his guilt. Miss Marple offered him a seat, her expression kind, yet knowing. "Thank you for coming, Reverend," she said softly, pouring tea into delicate porcelain cups. "I find that sometimes a good cup of tea can help clear one's mind." Cartwright lowered himself into the chair, his hands trembling slightly as he accepted the cup. He stared into the steam rising from the tea, as if searching for answers in the swirling mist. Miss Marple watched him for a moment before speaking again. "You must be exhausted," she said gently. "The burden of carrying a secret so long must be a heavy one." He gave a small bitter laugh. "It has been a burden, Miss Marple, a burden I thought I could bear forever. But I was wrong. Albert Eldridge's death, it was never meant to be this way. I only wanted to protect Richard. I didn't want the truth to ruin him." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her gaze calm but penetrating. "And yet you protected him by silencing Albert. You thought that by stopping Albert from revealing the past, you could safeguard the future. But in doing so, you ended up destroying more than you ever imagined." Cartwright's shoulders slumped further, and he took a shaky breath. "I never meant for it to go this far. It was all supposed to stay in the past. Reginald's actions, Louisa's death, my role in it. Albert was the last person who knew the full truth, and he was relentless. He would have exposed everything, all the shame, all the guilt that had festered for years." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Yes, but what you didn't realize, Reverend, was that the truth doesn't always stay buried. It never truly disappears. It waits quietly until the time is right." Cartwright's eyes met hers, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I could control it. I thought that if I kept everything hidden, the village would remain untouched. But now, it's all out in the open." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "No, Reverend. The truth is out, yes, but it doesn't change what happened. The bell has tolled, and with it, justice has come." He sat back in his chair, defeated. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I thought I was protecting them, protecting Richard. But now I'm the one who's lost everything." Miss Marple took a slow sip of her tea, considering her next words carefully. "Reverend Cartwright, sometimes the best way to protect those we care about is to allow them to face the truth. You tried to shield Richard from the past, but in doing so, you kept him bound to it. The only way forward now is through honesty, no matter how painful it may be." He nodded, his expression filled with resignation. "I see that now. But it's too late for me, isn't it?" Miss Marple placed her teacup gently on the saucer, her voice calm but firm. "It's never too late to make amends, Reverend. But first, you must face the consequences of your actions. You've already taken the first step by admitting the truth to yourself." Cartwright sat in silence, his hands trembling again. He looked out the window, as if searching for some kind of redemption, some way to make things right. Miss Marple remained silent, giving him space to process. Finally, after a long pause, Cartwright looked back at Miss Marple, his eyes filled with a kind of quiet resolve. "I know what I must do now. I'll face the consequences. I'll make sure the truth is heard." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. "That is the only way forward, Reverend. The only way to set things right." As the sun began to set outside, casting a golden glow over the village, Miss Marple and Reverend Cartwright sat together in the quiet of the room, the weight of the past lifting just a little, as the first real step toward redemption was taken. Chapter 11. The Bell's Final Toll. The days that followed were filled with the quiet resolution of what had been set in motion. Reverend Cartwright, after his confession, had gone to the local constable and turned himself in. The truth of the past, hidden for so long, had finally been exposed, and with it the darker corners of St. Mary Mead's history. Albert Eldridge had been right all along. The bell would ring to reveal the truth. Miss Marple stood once again in the churchyard, watching as the villagers gathered for the memorial service. The air was still and cool, and the towering presence of the bell loomed above her, silent for the moment, but no longer an enigma. The truth had been brought to light, and in the quiet solemnity of the service, justice had begun its slow process of healing the village's wounds. As the service began, the sound of the bell rang out across the village, loud and clear, each toll marking the passing of another secret, another layer of guilt peeled away. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the crowd, taking note of those who looked relieved, those who still held something back, and those whose faces betrayed the weight of their actions. Eleanor, though shaken, had returned to the village to pay her respects, her hands folded tightly in front of her. She cast a wary glance toward Mrs. Havisham, whose own face was set in stone, her eyes as cold as ever. Richard Havisham stood beside her, his shoulders tense, his gaze turned toward the ground. The strain of his family's history had taken its toll on him, but Miss Marple could see that there was something different about him now. He seemed less burdened, perhaps knowing that the truth had been acknowledged, even if the past could never be undone. As the final toll of the bell faded into the stillness, Miss Marple made her way toward the graveyard, where Albert Eldridge would soon be laid to rest. She paused by the stone, her fingers brushing the cold granite. The bell, once silent, now stood as a monument to the truth, its toll not just a sound, but a declaration of the hidden past finally brought to light. Reverend Cartwright had confessed, but his penance would be long and hard. The village would never forget the role he had played in protecting the Havishams, nor the web of lies he had spun to conceal the truth. But Miss Marple knew that the greatest form of redemption came not from penance alone, but from the willingness to confront the past and live with the consequences. She stepped back, turning to face the village as the final rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. St. Mary Mead would always remember this day, the day the bell tolled once more, and the silence was finally broken. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet sigh, her mind already turning to the next mystery that awaited. But for now, she stood still, listening to the echoes of the bell. Unmistakable reminder that, in the end, truth always finds its way to the surface. Chapter 12. Echoes in St. Mary Mead. The village of St. Mary Mead, though touched by the shadow of Albert Eldridge's tragic death, slowly returned to its everyday rhythm. The bell in the tower, having told its final revelation, now stood as a reminder of the tangled past and the courage it took to face it. The sun began to dip low in the sky, casting long golden shadows across the quiet streets, as Miss Marple walked down the familiar path toward the village square. As she passed the quiet houses, the soft sounds of evening, the rustle of leaves, the distant chatter of villagers closing their doors, seemed to whisper the peace that was slowly settling over the village. But Miss Marple knew that peace was often fragile. She had seen it before. The truth, no matter how painful, had a way of unsettling people. And in St. Mary Mead, where nothing ever seemed to happen, the cracks in its seemingly perfect facade had begun to show. She paused before the church once again, her gaze resting on the bell tower. The bell would now ring only when it was needed, no longer bound by silence or secrets. It had spoken its truth, and though the villagers would slowly forget the specifics of the tragedy, the toll of that bell would remain etched in the collective memory. Eleanor Davenport, though she had been shaken by the events, seemed to find some peace in knowing that the truth had come to light. She had returned to her family's home, but Miss Marple sensed that her life would never be the same. The secrets she had kept for so long had been brought into the open, and the weight of her past had lightened, if only just. Richard Havisham, too, seemed to carry a burden less heavy now. He had been forced to face the reality of his family's legacy, and though the path forward would not be easy, Miss Marple could see the beginnings of change in him. He was no longer the man running from the past, but one who had to learn to live with it. As for Mrs. Havisham, her cold demeanour had not softened, but Miss Marple knew that deep within something had cracked. The truth had a way of breaking the hardest hearts. And though Mrs. Havisham would never admit it, she had been forever altered by the events that had transpired. Miss Marple turned away from the church, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The village had changed, and yet it remained the same. St. Mary Mead would continue its quiet existence, its secrets buried once again beneath layers of time. But Miss Marple knew the truth. No secret, no matter how well kept, could remain hidden forever. As she made her way home, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a small, quiet satisfaction. Another mystery had been solved, another web of deceit unravelled. The village would return to its normal, peaceful routine, but Miss Marple knew she would always be there, waiting for the next mystery to unfold, and for the truth to once again find its voice.